Hey everyone, and welcome back to another tutorial. I'm Mohammad Hassan, and in this series we are talking about data structures and algorithms in JavaScript. In this particular video we are going to talk about the JavaScript Dequeue data structure, and I have already talked about the JavaScript stack, the JavaScript queue, and the Khan's algorithm for topological sort in JavaScript. You should find the links in the description of this video. If you have not subscribed to the channel yet, do it right now so you don't miss any notifications for the upcoming content that I'm going to upload. And without further ado, let's get started. Alright, so first you have to make sure that you have cloned the project. If you have not done yet, you can just go to github.com/snirs and then fun with JavaScript project. Once you are here, you can quickly clone or copy the URL from here. And once you have copied it, you can clone it within your machine. So in order to clone it, you can just type git clone and then paste the URL. And once you are done, it should create a project named Fun with JavaScript within your machine, and then you can just open it in your favorite editor. For this exercise, I'm going to be using VS Code, and the particular branch that we are interested in is called JS-Dequeue start. So you would do git checkout JS-Dequeue start, and once you are done with that, you are on the branch. Make sure that you have all the packages installed by running npm install, and once you are done with that, you can just run npm start. This basically starts up the Webpack server and also watches for any changes that you do. Now the code that we are going to work with is inside the JS-Dequeue folder, but we are going to look at it a bit later. Let's try to understand first what is a Dequeue. So a Dequeue data structure is a unique data structure which is similar to queue and stack and has both the capabilities of the queue and stack, which means that I can actually add items to both sides of the queue. I can add it to the front or to the rear. Similarly, I can remove an item from the front or from the rear. Let's actually compare this with stack and queue. So in a stack and queue, if we just look at the stack first, you can see that in the stack, when we push items in the sequence of 1, 2, 3, 4, just like this, 1, 2, 3, 4, then this 1 is actually at the front of the stack, and then the rear is 4. Consider this like a book. So if I inverse this stack, so to say, and imagine that these are the 4 books that I have put on a table, and I put this one first, this one second, this third, and this fourth, then the top of the book is this fourth. Now if I have to take out anything from the stack, that's gonna be from the rear, which means here. Then I can take out this one, then I can take out this one, and finally this. In the case of queue, it's different. If I'm putting the items in sort of this sequence, then this is the front of the queue and this is the rear of the queue. Towards the front of the queue, we have the item which came in first, and towards the rear of the queue, we have the item which came in last. Since queue follows first in, first out, then if I have to take an item out of the queue, that has to be the front item from the queue. And then I can take out the second item. Similarly, I can take out the third item and then the fourth item. So as you already know that queue is sort of the opposite of stack, because stack follows the last in, first out, and queue follows the first in, first out. But when it comes to the Dequeue, I can actually add items to either side. So if I add an item here, now this 30 is actually at the front of the queue as well as rear of the queue, because it's only one item. Now if I wanted to add another item to the rear side, that would be something like this. And now if I want to add this 20 to the front of the queue, that means I have to move these 2 items forward so I can make place for this one. And now this item is at the front of the queue. Similarly, now 40 can be added either to the rear of the queue or to the front of the queue. If I move it to the front, then I would obviously have to move all of these forward, and then I can move it here. Now in order to remove the item from a Dequeue, I can either remove it from the rear or from the front. If I remove it from the front, that means that all of these items now would have to go something like this. And if I have to remove something from the rear, I can simply remove it like this. Now let's have a look at the code that we have, or actually the UI that we have already built for the JS-Dequeue. So here, if I refresh the application and remove the breakpoints, let's see what happens. So here, you can see that we have a JS-Dequeue, and then we have some words or some characters as the items of this Dequeue. You can see that we have the front of the Dequeue and the rear of the Dequeue. This word that we are using is radar and has 5 elements. And if I talk about what is the item towards the rear, that is this R. And if I talk about what is at the front, this is this one. Now in this Dequeue exercise, we should be able to add items to the rear side, which should be done by this button. Then we should be able to remove from rear, and we should be able to peek the rear item. Similarly, we should be able to add to front, remove from front, and peek the front item. And obviously we should be able to see the size of the queue and then check if the queue is empty or actually clear the entire queue. Now all of this functionality is not implemented yet, and that is what we are going to do in this exercise. So if I show you the code right now, we have a simple index.html in which we have all these buttons and the box. This is quite similar to what we had in the queue. Then if we talk about the main.js, it only has this render dequeue method in which we accept an items array, and then it loops over the items array to add each item to the UI box that we have. And then in the main, you can see that we are basically taking a string, and then we are using the split method on the string to create an array, which we pass here, and then it basically adds this to the UI. We would essentially use the dequeue here instead of hard-coding a string here. So let's go to the Dequeue.js and see what it looks like. You can see that this is an empty class here, and we are going to implement the details of this class in JavaScript. So first of all, we need to have some methods here. So similar to how we have in the queue, we basically add items to the rear side of the queue. So we are going to start with the rear functions. So we have add to rear, and there we have an item. Similarly, we have remove from rear, and then we don't need any argument here. Then we have peek rear, and then we can talk about the front functions. So we have add to front, and then we have remove from front, and then we have peek front. And then finally we have is empty method that we had in the queue class as well. Then we have the size method, and then we have the clear method. Now that we have all the function defined, we need to talk about the variables that we are going to use, or the properties that we are going to use that will help us manage this dequeue. So the first one is items. So this is going to be an object just like we had in the queue exercise. Then we would have two properties. One would be item to add front key, which will be the index to which the next item we will add towards the front side of the queue. Similarly, we would have item to add rear key, and this will also be 0 because in the beginning it's just the 0 index. Now let's talk about the rear functionality. So first of all, what we are going to do is just implement these three methods, and then we are going to look at the UI to see how they work. So first of all, if we talk about the rear, this is pretty easy, and it's just like the queue that we had. So we are going to say this dot items, and here we are going to say this dot item to add rear key, and then we are going to assign the item at this index. And then we are going to just say this dot item to add rear key plus plus. When we are going to remove an item from the rear side, it's also similar to how we did in the queue class. So we are going to say const item to remove, and then we are going to say this dot items. So first we are going to get the item. So here we are going to say this dot item to add rear key -1, and then we are going to say delete, and then we are going to use the same logic here, and then we are going to return item to remove, and finally we are going to say this dot item to rear key -. So what we are doing here is that we are getting the last item that was added. Remember that this item to add rear key is the key where we have to add the next item. But what about the current item that is on the rear side? In order to get that, we are using the -1 syntax here. And finally, to peek towards the rear side, we also need to do the same thing. So we are going to just return this particular item. So I hope this makes sense now. We're going to quickly implement the empty, size, and clear methods as well. So here for the size one, we already know from the queue exercise that we can return this dot item to add rear key minus this dot item to add front key. And this should essentially give us the result of the size of the items that we have in the dequeue. In order to clear the queue, we can simply say this dot items equals empty object. So we are going to reset it to an empty object. Then we are going to say this dot item to add front key equals to 0. So we are going to reset it as well. And then this dot item to add rear key equals to 0. So we are resetting both of the indexes or both of the values of these variables. Finally, for the isEmpty, we need to return if the size method returns 0. So if the size is 0, then we know that this dequeue is empty and does not have any items in it. So this is a lot of implementation that we have done right now. let's actually implement this with the buttons so we can see what's going on in the Dequue. So I'm going to go to this main.js and I'm going to just remove all of this. And then I'm going to basically use the snippet for the handler buttons. And here is what we have. So we have a method which is initiate handlers, which I'm going to call from the main method. And here what we have is we are actually getting access to all the buttons that are on the UI. So we have the add to rear button, peek rear button, remove from rear button, and then we have the same buttons for the front side. And then we have the clear button, which clears the Dequue. All right. You can see that here we are using a myDequue variable, which does not exist at the moment. So essentially we need to import this Dequue class to create a Dequue instance or a Dequue in our main.js. So here we are going to simply say import Dequue from Dequue. And then we are going to create an instance of it. So we can say my or myDequue. And then we are going to say new Dequue. And this creates our variable myDequue, which can be used here. So you can see that we have handlers for clear button, which clears the Dequue and then it renders the Dequue again. Similarly, we have the add to rear button, which essentially generates a random number, then it adds to the rear side and then it re-renders the Dequue. For the remove button, you can see that it removes from the rear side, then it re-renders the Dequue and then it peeks with this function that we have not defined yet. And finally, the peek rear button also uses this method that we need to define with the side of the rear. So we are going to quickly add this function and I'm going to show you what that does. So here's the snippet that we have. This is the peekDequeue method, which essentially takes side as a parameter. Since we have now two sides where the user could peek, so we have the front side and we have the rear side, and these are defined with this constant. So we have peek sides.front and peek sides.rear. We check if the peek side.front was provided, then we essentially target the first child of the Dequue, which is the leftmost child, and then we highlight it. If it's not the front side and if it's the rear side, then we basically take the last child and then we highlight that as well. So this is pretty much the logic behind the peekDequeue. So now our handlers for the rear side and the peek are actually done, also for the clear button as well. And now that we have the handlers in place, notice that in the render Dequue, we are not passing anything, whereas this render Dequue accepts an items array. And by default, it analyzes it with the empty array. So instead of the empty array, we need to make sure that we are using the Dequue items. So we can say object.values, and here we could say myDequue.items. So it basically converts this items object into an array of the values from the object, and then we can render it. So if I refresh the page now, and if I try to click this add to rear button, you can see that we are adding items to the rear side of the queue. If I peek the rear side, you can see that it highlights the last item or the item from the rear side. And if I remove from rear, you can see that it removes the item and then highlights the next item to be removed. So this functionality is working pretty much as it would do for a stack, because we are adding to the rear side and then we are removing it from the rear side as well, which is the last in first out event. Now let's talk about these handlers that we want here. So we have to call the add to front, remove from front, and peek front. And right now we also have the clear implemented. So if I clear this, you should be able to see that the whole queue is removed. So in order to implement the functions for the front side, let's go back to the Dequeue.js. And here we have the functions. So when we talk about adding to the front, there are a few cases which we need to handle. First of all, if the queue is empty, then we don't care if we are adding to the front or the rear because it's exactly the same. So since we have the logic already here implemented, we can just use the add to rear method in case the queue is empty. So we can say if this dot is empty, then we are going to use the add to rear method here, and then we are just going to pass the item, which should essentially add it to the queue. Otherwise, we are going to check if this dot item to front key is greater than 0, then we have to do some magic here. So if we have this key greater than 0, that means that we have removed an item already from the front. So imagine that we have these items in the queue. If I remove an item from here now, from the front, let's say if I remove 2 items now, and now if I have to add this 20 to the front side of the queue, which index should I use? That's going to be the index 1 because we have removed 2 items already, and the least index that we have right now here is 2. So we need to add this to the index 1. So before we jump actually into what code we would put here, let's tackle the remove from front. In order to remove an item from front side, we need to have the item to remove. For that, we can simply say const item to remove, and here we can say this dot items, and then we are going to call this dot item to add front key, and then we are going to say delete this dot items, and then this dot item to add front key, and then finally we are going to say this dot item to add front key plus plus, and then we are going to say return item to remove. So what we are doing here is that this item to add front key acts as an index of the last item that was added. So maybe we could just rename this to item to remove front key, and that makes more sense. So let's just go here, and then I'm going to rename this to item to remove front key. So if we go back to this Miro example, you can see that if I have to remove this 20 from the Dequeue, this 1 should be the value of the item to remove key. Once I remove this item from the queue, then the next item to be removed is 2, and that's why we are incrementing the key to know what item is the next item to be removed from the front side. And that's what we are doing here in the code as well. Now that we know how this function works, we also know that if this item to remove front key is greater than 0, that means that we already have some items removed from the front side. So we can say here is that, hey, this dot item to remove front key should be decremented. So we get another index behind the current index, and then we do a this dot items, this dot item to add front key or item to remove front key, and then here we can say item. So what we are doing here is that we know that from the Miro example, if the item to remove front key was 2, then we do a minus minus. So we have the item to remove front key set to 1, and then we add an item to that place. Now, if I want to remove an item from the Dequeue from the front side, this exact item would be removed next. Now that we have these functions here, let's actually go to the main.js to add some handlers for these buttons. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to copy these 3 methods, go down and paste the values from it. So I'm going to just do add to rear button, from here to add to front button. Then this is going to be the peek front button. And finally we have remove from front button. In the add to front button, we are also doing the same thing, but here we are going to say add to front. And here from the remove one, we are going to say remove from front. And then for the peek one, we can say peek dot front. And we are also going to change it here as well. So this removal is also peeking to the front one. Now that we have this, let's test this on the UI. So here I'm refreshing the page. Let's go forward. And then what I'm going to do is I'm just going to put some breakpoints here. And then we are going to add our first item using the front side. So if I do this, you can see that we get the random number here. Then it calls the add to front method. And here it's going to check if the Dequeue is empty, which it is. So this is going to go to the add to rear. And then here it's going to do what add to rear would do. So I'm just going to hit the play button so you can see that this added to this value. And now if I add a couple of items using the add to rear method, and then if I remove an item from the front, which should remove this 32. So we are now going to test the second condition that we talked about. So I'm going to remove one. So this basically calls remove from front. It goes here. And now we know that the item to be removed should have the index or the key 0. So this is the remove front key that we have. The item that we want to remove is 32. So the item to remove is 32. Then we delete this item from the queue or from the items array. So you can see that we have at the 0 key, we have 32. So this is going to delete that. And now we don't have it. And then we have item to remove front key, which we are increasing to 1, which basically tells us that the next item to be removed should have the key 1. So you can see that the next item towards the front side has the key 1. And then we basically return this and then it peaks and whatnot. Now, if I have to add an item to the front side, it is going to go to the next condition that we talked about. So it's going to go inside here. This will find that the Dequeue is not empty, but the item to remove front key is greater than 0. So here it's going to add another key, or basically it's first going to decrement this value from 1 to 0. So now it will become 0. And now towards the items, it will add to the 0 key this particular element. So now you can see that here in the items we have another new item which is 12, which has been passed here, and now it will be re-rendered here in the queue. So we added an item from the front side. Now the only thing remaining is what would happen if we have not removed anything from the queue. So we already have the item to remove front key set to 0. In that particular case, we have to push every item to the next place, and then we have to make space for this item at the index 0. So let's actually write that in the code. So we are going to go to the Dequeue.js, and here we are going to put another condition with the else. And here first we are going to shift all the items up one index. For that we are going to use a for loop. We are going to say, hey, let I equals this dot item to add rear key, and then here we are going to say I greater than equals to 1, because we want it to run to 1 because we are going to add the item to index 0. And we are going to simply say I minus minus here, and then finally we are going to say this dot items index I should actually get the item from the previous index. So we are going to say items I minus 1, and here we are going to shift all the items forward one index. Once we are done with that, we can simply say this dot items 0 equals item. So we are making the space for the index 0 here, and then we are assigning the new item to the index 0 here. And finally we just need to do this dot item to add rear key plus plus. Why are we doing this? Because we added another item to the queue. So we need to make sure that the rear key has one more index now. So now that we have done this, let's check this out. So I'm going to refresh this now, and then I'm going to add one item to front, a couple of items to the rear. Then I'm not going to remove any item from here, and let's check if we add an item to the front. So here it comes and generates a random number, which is 12 now. And then it goes inside here. It will go past these two conditions, and now we have to shift all the items up one index, which means that this 8 is going to be at the key 6, and then this will go on and on. So once we are done with all the things, you should be able to see that now we have moved everything up one index apart from this 0 1, because this is where we are going to push this particular item. So at 0 right now we have its previous value, which was 37, and you can see that each item moved one index up. And now we are going to assign this, and the item to rear key that was 6 before, now it's going to be 7, which means that the next item that we need to add is going to be added at the index 7 or with the key 7. So now if I play, you should be able to see this 12 appearing on the left side or on the front side of it. Now you can see that if we try to add an item to the front, we can do that. If we want to remove an item from the front, we can also do that. If you want to add to the rear, that can be done. I can add to front as well, and then I can remove from the rear, or I can remove from the front. So all of these things work perfectly fine now. If you want to peek to the front side, you can see it highlights it, and towards the rear side, it also works. So I believe that now you have a quick understanding of how this Dequeue works at both the front and the rear side by adding or removing the item. One thing that I know is that if I want to peek this rear side here, you cannot see it on the UI, and that's because it's right here. And then if I now peek it, you can see it. So let's just modify the code to do a really quick trick. So we are going to go to the main.js, and here where we are peeking, we basically need to go to the peekDequeue method. And here, before adding the classes, we can simply say peeked element dot scroll into view. And this will make sure that before highlighting the peeked element, we are actually scrolling that into the view. So if I refresh now, and if I try to add a couple of items here, you can see that we got the scroll. And if I need to peek the rear item, you can see that it scrolls first and then peeks. And then if I peek the front one, you can also see that it peeks and scrolls. So now this is working perfectly fine. And if I want, I can clear this queue as well. And that's pretty much it about the implementation of this Dequeue class. Now let's talk about one practical example where we want to use this Dequeue in real life. One of the problems that Dequeue can solve really quick is checking if a word is a palindrome, which means that it has the same word from either sides if we go towards the center of the word. So in order to check that, we are just going to go ahead in our index.html, and then here we are going to add another section which can take an input as a word, and then we can check if that word is a palindrome or not. So what we have here is basically a form group with an input and then a button that has this value check, and we have the IDs on both of these. So if I refresh the view, you can see that we have this input that we are going to talk about. So we are going to go to the main.js really quick, and here in the handlers, we are going to add the logic for these input and the check button. So this is what we had for the snippet for this palindrome button. So what we do here is that we basically add an event listener to it, and then we basically check the value of the input. We get that value from the input, and then we basically run it against a function which should check if this is a palindrome or not. And then once we get the result, we alert if this particular string that we talked about, is that a palindrome or is that not a palindrome? So the only thing that we need to do right now is to implement this check if palindrome function. So let's quickly create it. So I'm going to just create it as this method. We are going to basically have a string here as an argument, and then we are going to return a value which is either true or false. So first of all, let's say we have a variable and we will call it is palindrome, and then we are going to initially suppose that this is true, and then we are going to check each value, and then if that's not the case, then we'll change it to false. So first of all, we need to create a dequeue here. So I'm just going to say const pal dequeue, and here we are going to say dequeue. And then what we are going to do first is to add each string character to this pal dequeue. So we are going to say string dot split, and then we are going to split it to create an array, and then we are going to run a for each on this one, and then we have each character here, and then we simply say pal deque dot add to rear, and then here we basically pass the character. So this should basically add all the characters of this string to the dequeue in the items object. Once we are done with this, we need to check if this is a palindrome by running a while loop, and finally we are going to return the is palindrome variable. So here we are going to run a while loop, and here we are going to say, hey, run this while the size of the queue is greater than 1. So we are going to say pal dequeue dot size is greater than 1. So as long as this is true, we are good. And we are also going to make sure that this is running when the is palindrome is true. So when that becomes false, we need to immediately get out of this while loop, because that would be false and we can return it right away. So here what we are going to see is we are going to take out the front and the back of the palindrome. So we are sure that, hey, the values that we are talking about, it's actually of a palindrome string. So let's talk about a sample string, which is radar, as an example. So here we are going to say front equals, and then we are going to say pal deque dot remove from front. And then we are going to say const rear equals to pal deque dot remove from rear. And once we are done with that, this front should first get this R, and this rear should get this R. And then we are going to check if they are equal or not. So we are going to see if front for some reason is not equals to rear, then we are going to say is palindrome equals false. And as soon as we do that, this should exit the while loop, because we have this as a condition here, right? So now we are done with this. We can simply check this if it's working. So in the first iteration, it will check the R and R. In the second iteration, it will take this A and A. And finally, we would have this D. But since the size of the palindrome queue would be 1, then this will also exit the while loop. And we know that this radar is a palindrome. So let's save this real quick, and now let's test this out. So here I'm just going to put breakpoints to our code, so we know that we are covering all the things that we require. So here I'm just going to put a breakpoint here, and then we are going to use the radar as an example. So here if I click check, you will see that we get the input first, and then we have the value which we are passing as a string, which is radar. So we are passing this as a string here. I'm going to put a breakpoint here as well. And then we go inside here, and then we have the string value here. Now you can check that the value is supposed to be true here. Then we create a dequeue here, and then we basically split the whole string, and then we add each item to the pal dequeue. You can see the items are none here. And then if we move forward, you can see that now the queue has all the characters at the indices that we talked about. You can see that we also have these values changed as well according to the dequeue. Now it will go inside the while loop, because both of these conditions are true. First of all, it will take the front and rear elements initially from this string, which is radar. So we should get R and R for both of these. And now you can see that the front and rear both have the same values. And if we go further, and in the next iteration, you can see that we got A for both front and rear. And then this will move forward. And then you see that this is palindrome is true for this case. And we should get the alert that the string radar is a palindrome. Now let's talk about another one, which is this one. So this is also a valid palindrome. So if we go forward with this one, this will be again a palindrome. But if I add another value to here, let's say this one, then in this case, this will go inside. And then when the function is running, this will potentially find a place where the front and rear will not be equal. For instance, here, the front is A, but the rear is A as well. So it will go forward. But here we have the front D, but the rear would be a bit different, which is X. So in this case, the front is not equal to rear. It will go here. It will mark this palindrome as false and immediately exit the while loop. And now we have false as a value here. And then now we should be showing an alert which says string rexor is not a palindrome. And that's actually it about this whole exercise. So now we have implemented the Dequeue in terms of the UI as well. And now we have implemented a real world example, which is checking the palindrome problem via Dequeue. Alright, so I hope that you liked the video. If you did, give this a big thumbs up. If you have not subscribed to the channel yet, do it right now. And let me know in the comments what data structures or algorithms you would like me to cover in this series. And as always, happy coding, and I'm gonna see you in the next video.